We're back with our sixth episode of the Utility Strategy Podcast, the first infrastructure podcast to shine a light on what we love to call utility strategy. As we all know, buried utilities pose an enormous risk to any infrastructure project, often causing schedule overruns, unexpected costs, and of course, utility strikes. But with the right utility strategy, we're able to mitigate that risk and streamline our project, and that's what our podcast is all about. Sharing and gaining all kinds of insights that will enable just that, helping project managers, utility coordinators, estimators, mappers, planners, designers, engineers, and any other stakeholders overcome the
Project
challenges
owners.
of buried
There you
utilities.
go.
Project owners as well, overcome the buried utilities in our right of way. To help us do just that, we have here with us today Geoff Zeiss, who's going to talk to us about our industry's biggest problems and what we can do to solve them. So a bit about Geoff. You probably know him from his blog Between the Poles, where he tracks the contribution of geospatial technology to the digitalization of the construction and energy industries. Geoff's focus area is locating, mapping, and sharing information about underground utility infrastructure. He has been an advisor to a number of underground mapping initiatives, including our company 4M Analytics, also Singapore Digital Underground, Minnesota Underground Utility Mapping Project, and the National Underground Asset Register in the UK. You should know that in 2014, in recognition of his efforts to increase the awareness of geospatial data and technologies in the construction and utility sectors, Geoff received the Geospatial Ambassador Award at Geospatial World Forum in Geneva, Switzerland. Um, Geoff, let's get started. How are you doing today?
Just wonderful.
Fantastic.
Good. I got to start by asking, what's the problem? What are we up against? Let's kind of put it out there.
So let me put this in context at a macro level to start with.
Let's do
If
that.
you look at the U.S. economy, underground infrastructure probably represents a drag of somewhere between $33 billion and $90 billion on the U.S. economy. Now,
Wow.
those numbers, I believe, are probably an underestimate, but there is good factual support for those numbers that I just gave you. If you start looking at the other impacts of underground infrastructure, you already mentioned the fact that a lot of projects are delayed, there's budget overruns. I mean, according to the Federal Highway Administration in the United States, it is the biggest source of risk on civil engineering projects, not knowing where things are underground. The second thing is that this is not only an economic problem, but it also affects people's health, the health of workers, the health of the public. And the statistics indicate that something over 20 years, you're probably seeing on the order of hundreds of deaths and thousands of injuries. And it means any worker who's on a site and is putting a shovel in the ground is at risk.
Now,
And this risk is actually higher than getting on an airplane, to be
Geoff, I'm
honest.
going to ask you a question.
Now-
Sorry. Do you think this is highlighted by COVID or the actual strain on the infrastructure, or because
I think COVID probably reduced the incidence of injuries to public because there's just a lot less traffic. There was a lot less traffic. And in fact, in some jurisdictions, people went out and had projects specifically to look for underground infrastructure because there's so less traffic. And the reality is that if you go out with a ground penetrating radar or an electromagnetic device to try to find things underground, you're often walking in heavy traffic. So this is a very risky profession. So this represents a serious risk to workers. It also represents a risk to the public. But if you go out there in the morning and you say, I'm going to dig a hole in the ground on a construction project, you have a significant risk of being electrocuted, blown up in a gas explosion, or other things.
Wow. So I'm going to ask you a question. In terms of the tax on the infrastructure, in terms of taxing the infrastructure, I thought that COVID really showed what our lag is in terms of the infrastructure and how taxed our current infrastructure is in terms of its capability to hang on and capability to really keep up with our current lives.
Oh yeah. So if you're talking about the capacity or the maintenance and so on, I mean, you look at the ASE scorecard, for example, which is it's usually D or C minus or something, and that scorecard applies to all of our infrastructure. The reason Biden has introduced this huge, 1.2 trillion dollar infrastructure spending bill in the U.S.
Yep.
is that our infrastructure is falling apart in North America, and we've got to spend a lot of money on it now. The interesting thing about this leads to a little bit of a macro perspective, macroeconomic perspective on what is going on with infrastructure. In the past, most infrastructure, roads, highways, bridges, schools, and so on, was built by government. And they were looking for a social return. So they invested $100 million in a new highway or something like that. That meant that somebody could get to Manitoba quicker, whatever. The reality is that since about 2003, there has been a lot of private investment going into infrastructure, coming from sovereign wealth funds, pension plans, insurance companies. There's something like 60 or 70 trillion dollars out there. And in the
Wow.
past, not much of that went to infrastructure, but since 2003, the amount going to infrastructure has been growing. Now, the big difference between a government investing in infrastructure and private money going into infrastructure is that governments want a social return, private money wants a financial return. And when you want a financial return, the way you do that, especially in the construction industry where productivity has been stagnant for 50 years. If you look at aircraft manufacturing, automobile manufacturing, productivity has more than doubled over that period of time. If you look at construction in U.S., U.K., Germany, Japan, South Korea, all the world's advanced economies, it has been stagnant. In the U.S., it's actually declined. Productivity has gotten worse in construction. Okay. So we've got this problem where we've got private money going into infrastructure, which means construction. We've got a stagnant productivity problem in construction. The result is a lot of money is going to go into technology to improve productivity. And in the United States, the amount of money going into construction startups is phenomenal. It exceeds any other sector.
Wow. No.
And we see examples in underground stuff. I mean, you guys, you look at the number of small startups that are able to raise venture capital funding now. It's incredible how much is going on in construction. So on a macro level, that's what's really driving this. It's basically, construction is 10% of the world's economy, right? This is a big thing. And if it continues to cost to build things as much as it has in the past, we are never going to be able to get our infrastructure, getting back to your original point, Ophir, we're never going to be able to get our infrastructure up to where, or afford to get it up to where we need it to be. So construction, to me, construction productivity is the big macro. And to me, the lowest hanging fruit on addressing this problem of productivity in construction is underground infrastructure. Everybody knows it's a problem. We know the magnitude of the problem. We know the ROI. We have multiple studies saying that if you invest $1 in improving our information about underground infrastructure, we make $21, we make $30, we make 33 pounds, whatever. I mean, it's a no-brainer. I mean, most municipalities are happy if they have an ROI of 2 or 3. We're talking about an ROI of 20, 30. I mean, it's incredible. And I think the awareness of the problem and the awareness of the payback from the investment is now reaching a lot of people. And so a lot of stuff is happening. I mean, 4M is an example.
Now, Geoff, I'm going to ask you a question.
But there's a lot of other companies that are doing
a really focused question here. I've been in the industry since '97. And it's really been a tough go trying to convince people to invest money in engineering. And now we're at a point where we're saying, wait a minute, let's also invest money in technology. What do you think is going to be that difference that's going to actually push it? Or did you answer that by saying because it's venture capital that's actually pushing it now, that it's actually going to adapt and pivot?
Yeah, I think it's the awareness. I think the awareness is there. I think the fact that everybody knows that construction productivity is our big problem. Everybody's talking about infrastructure. You put that together, and to me, it's a no-brainer. I mean, it's
Okay.
happening now. When 1997, I mean, I started looking at underground infrastructure 25 years ago. I mean, you'd always find a little group somewhere that was doing something about it, knew something about it. But if you started talking to somebody at a C level or serious
It was
government
a
level,
niche.
or they never heard of it, they say, "What's the problem with underground stuff? I mean, what do you mean when I dig a hole, I have to call somebody? What's that all about?" Now that I was talking to somebody this morning, and when you go into a utility or you go into a government or you go into a contractor and you say, "Listen, I've got a solution for your underground problem." In the past, they'd say, "Underground problem? What do you mean underground problem?" Now you go in, they know what you're talking about. Every contractor knows what you're talking about. You go into a contractor from the CEO down and say, "Listen, I got a solution for your underground problem." They all know what you're talking about. You don't have to sell them on the problem. You just have to sell them on the solution.
So we're
But
past
Jeff,
that.
still we're
Sorry,
seeing,
we're past that.
still
Also,
we're
yeah.
seeing.
Go ahead, David. We're both so eager to get in
It's,
here.
yeah, no, it's also the differences between of the streaming of the video.
Yeah.
But so I was gonna say that still, despite all the measures and the 811 and the quality levels and all this stuff, we're still not seeing a decline in strikes, and we're still seeing projects needing to relocate utilities in the middle of a project, and we're still seeing these delays and these overruns and the additional costs. And it, it, to be honest, it doesn't seem like we've found the right solution yet.
Okay, so let me put in the context. I'll talk about North America first. In North America, every state in the US and just about every province in Canada has what's called a one call center. The idea is that before you put a shovel in the ground, you call them up. So you have a major highway project. During the design phase, you have no information about underground infrastructure. You design the thing using very good above ground surveyor information. Your surveyors go out, capture everything to centimeter accuracy. You have wonderful information about above ground. You have no information about below ground. 3 days before you put a shovel in the ground or a backhoe in the ground, you call up the one call center. They come out and paint the ground. There's no
Yeah.
liabilities. You don't know whether they're painting the right place or not painting the right place. In Ontario, we have problems with late locates. We call them up and they don't come within 3 days. They come 20 days later, holds up the project. Right? So, part of the problem is the universal solution in North America of one call centers. And as you said, the statistics show that this one call system does not reduce underground damage. You can
So
look
why
over the last 5 years. It does not reduce, maybe it prevents it from getting worse, but it does not improve it. I'll
why are
give
we
you another
waiting for
example.
why are we waiting for 3 days before we put a shovel in the ground? Why aren't we doing this at the design phase? Why isn't that happening?
Okay, that's a great lead on because that's where Colorado has really, really changed the whole thing. Colorado back in 2017 had a major disaster in Firestone. Gas line blew up, killed people, flattened the neighborhood. And within 3 years, by 2019, there was new legislation in Colorado that did two key things. One is it said before you do, during planning, up to 10% design, you have to do what's called a subsurface utility engineering survey, which means you need to know where everything is underground before you start designing something. Right? That gets right to your point. That avoids unnecessary, in other words, you design something not to cross over a major transmission line. You design something to avoid a transmission line. So you avoid major relocates, you avoid hitting things during construction that hold the project up and so on. So that was the first thing that happened in Colorado. And that applies to all major civil engineering projects involving the public right of way, state right of way in Colorado. So this is not just a few projects. This is all projects, basically. It's 95% of all projects. The other thing that has happened, and it's not only in Colorado, but also in Montana and a few other jurisdictions, is one of the biggest problems in this sector is that after you complete construction, you always have to submit what are called as-builts. Right? Those as-builts are notoriously unreliable. They are as design
As-
documents.
And
Oh,
not
In
the
other words,
first on the
Yeah.
podcast to say
no,
so.
I'm sure I'm
Yeah.
about the, so those documents have been notoriously unreliable. In both Colorado and Montana now, they have to be survey grade, which means that they have to be accurately captured. They have to be stamped by a PE or PLS, which means there's, you know how the construction works. You have to know who you're going to sue, right? If somebody's going to be sued, you know they're going to do a good job because they know they're going to be liable.
Yeah.
So
It's all about the liability.
in both those states, the as-builts now have to be stamped by
So
PE, PLS, which means there's somebody to
let's
sue.
go back on that. You're saying that in 2012, Canada came out with their CSA S250, and that was the as-built criteria, the as-built best practice. And it's been around since
Right.
2012, and it just got released into 2020. They did a little update.
Yep.
So we have the standard in Canada. Why is it not being used? Like it's really incredible. And from what you're saying is until it gets legislated, it's just going to be on the shelf. What?
Yeah. Yeah, and I'd say if you want to, so that's, we have the S250 in Canada. In the U.S., they
Right.
haven't had a stand.
For those who don't know, for our listeners who don't know, please break down.
Yeah.
What is it? What is
Oh,
yeah.
S250 is an
Yeah.
as-built standard. As Ophir said, it's an as-built standard which sets quality standards for as-built submissions.
Now,
Okay.
And it has different levels.
Good.
It's similar to the ASCE 38 standard for existing. So there's really two standards we're talking about. In North America, we're talking about ASCE 38, which was first published in 2002, which
Yeah.
sets basically standards for existing underground infrastructure. Right. The S250 sets standards for newly installed or newly relocated infrastructure. Right. So those two things, you have to keep those separate in your mind. In the United States, ASCE 38 is used for existing, and they are just for the first time releasing a new standard called ASCE 75, which will be their as-built standards, except they can't call it an as-built standards because of legal restrictions, so they call it an as-constructed standard, which is actually more accurate. I mean, as-built, sort of, you don't know whether it's a design document or whether it's a real, but in the United States. So now in the United States, they have ASCE 75, which is equivalent to in Canada S250. So we have standards for newly installed, newly relocated stuff, and we have standards for existing stuff.
so just so you all know, the
Yeah.
ASC 38 also with their rewrite is also now all utilities, and it's now investigated. It's now going to be focusing on investigating existing utilities, regardless if they're above or below ground. So really taking everything, putting it together.
And it also sets a minimum standard of what you have to do. The ASCE 38 standard it was new, it was very short, it was only 20 pages long, and it basically didn't specify much. It didn't say you had to do this. It wasn't prescriptive. It didn't say that you've done an ASCE 38 survey, SUE survey. You didn't really have to do much. Some people just went out and looked at some as-built, some records, and said that they'd done an ASCE. With the new standard, the ASCE 3821, it is prescriptive. It says this is the minimum you have to do to say that you've done a SUE survey. And that includes basically capturing the location of everything underground using remote sensing technology.
Interesting. So it's really interesting how we work into this remote sensing technology. It also gives you an update in terms of the technologies which are available. And the truth is, looking at technology today, I see an exponential growth in terms of technology and how it's getting released and how it's coming out. Geoff, is that the IRS calling you again, or one of the scamming IRS?
Yeah. I guess I didn't pay my taxes.
Or the Customs and Border Protection Agency calling you to send them a Walmart card right now.
I don't know what. I'm going to go have to take it off the hook if that keeps happening.
Anyways,
it's usually somebody calling from India saying that the Canadian border guys are going to grab me.
There we go, technology, VoIP. There you go.
Yeah.
Making communication.
Yeah, because yeah.
So
The thing that I would just add, Ophir, which is following up on your other question, is that yes, we have to mandate these standards. We can't just say, well, yeah, here it is, and take it or leave it. And in Colorado, for example, both those standards are mandated.
excellent.
In other words, if you work in Colorado, you have to apply ASCE 75 and you have to apply ASC 38.
So it's not thou shall and not please do.
No, it's you have to. And I think, some jurisdictions in Canada, I think, for example, Infrastructure Ontario is also requiring that AS, like 250 and ASC 38 have to be used on their transit projects, I believe, on their broadband projects, and I think also now on highway projects.
It's absolutely amazing. That's the BTFA and the BBFA, and there you go. You're not wanted yet, Geoff.
Yeah.
Now, the Building Broadband Fast Track and the Building Transit Fast Track actually include the TAC guidelines, the Transportation Association of Canada guidelines for P3, and that's the Utility Coordination, Utility Relocation process on a P3 project, which actually, or a design, an alternate delivery project, which actually puts in there that thou shalt start with seed information as per ASC 38, and thou shalt complete with CSAS 250 quality as-built. Now
absolutely.
It's really
We need more. We need more provincial jurisdictions doing this. Just saying, if you're going to work on a civil engineering project in this province, you have to use ASC 38 and S250.
Now, when I was going back to the technology item, I'll give you a great example. Back in 1992, when I was in the Israeli military, I had this great little green box, and it was the Garmin or a Garmin GPS unit, and I had 30 to 60 centimeter accuracy in 1992. Only in 2007, when I got out of the military and I was here working in utilities and working in the infrastructure, I was going, okay, where's my Garmin? And they said, no, total station, start pulling those chains. So the point being, the links and the chains, and the point being, only in 2007 did that technology get released to the public. That it really went mainstream when GPS started becoming that mainstream, and that's a huge, what is that? Let's see, 2002 to wow, that's a 15-year lag. Now, the way technology is evolving, the way things are going, I see things, which we dreamed of 3 years ago, now coming out and really getting pushed forward. How can we actually take all these different technologies and start using them, start applying them to our day-to-day investigations, our day-to-day lives, to improve our infrastructure mapping? If it took 15 years originally to get that initial GPS unit out, and now it's getting quicker.
Well, I think at this point, any construction worker can capture survey accuracy stuff with a cell phone.
Interesting.
With the RTK. But, anybody could do that. There's a number of companies providing that. There's a lot of companies that are already using that technology. You don't need a surveyor out there. You may want to have a surveyor reviewing what's being captured. Surveyors have to stay in the picture. But any construction worker on a project now can capture survey grade accuracy for newly installed stuff, newly exposed infrastructure and whatever. I think this locating, centimeter accuracy locating is no longer a problem. Anybody could do it. You can go to Trimble, you can go to Hexagon. They all have low-cost devices that you can just take out in the field, hook up to your cell phone, and capture survey grade.
Now, I know my friends from PSC Professional Surveyors Canada would have an issue with what you're saying here, but do you see that?
No, surveyors still. I'm not saying surveyors should be cut out, but the surveyors could actually be in the office reviewing the results and making sure that they conform to surveying standards and all that kind of stuff. But the reality is, most construction projects can't afford to have a survey crew out there permanently on site waiting for somebody to expose something underground or to put something in the ground, or to call up a survey crew to come out when they've just put something in the ground. It's just not economical. And I think the surveyors recognize that.
So,
the technology is just moving.
Geoff, I think that also talking about the economical perspective, I think it doesn't make sense to have as many teams in the field like we're seeing today. Because a lot of them are just doing the same thing. Like, we can have two projects crossing the same right of way, and they'll need to do more or less the same work there, and generate the same results. And
Yep.
there's no reason to have two teams in the field doing the same work.
I think you're getting into another area. You know, I tend to break this problem down into three sections. One is technology for detecting things underground, reality capture, you know, capturing new stuff that's going in the ground, which is sort of what we were just talking about.
Hmm.
And the other one is sharing information. And I would say that probably the thing with the biggest payback is sharing the information. In the United States, I mean, the rough estimate I've heard from people in the industry is that the U.S. spends $10 billion a year finding things. And it's exactly like you said, David. You know,
$15
if I'm going to
a
build
year.
a project right here this year, I call up the one call center. The guys all come out in their vans with their EM devices and whatever, tell me, you know, paint the ground and whatever. If I do another, you know, project in exactly the same area next year, the same thing will happen.
Yep.
They don't capture that information. They don't. They usually don't even capture it, and they certainly don't share it.
Interesting.
So
Why
this
aren't people
information,
sharing? Why isn't
there's
that
no
happening?
mechanism to do it. There's no mechanism to do it. That's what,
Interesting.
you know, that's what's going on in the UK. That is the big thing in the UK with the National Underground Asset Register, is a way of capturing this information and sharing it. So the way it works is that, you know, the utilities have records usually derived from as-built, which, as I said, are unreliable, right? So, but that is the single source of truth right now. And the reason in North America that people don't use those, you know, so in North America, like I said, there's a one call system. I call up the one call system. I say, this is where I'm going to dig. Well, you'd say, well, why don't they just send me paper records? Why don't they just send me digital records of what's there? The reason is they're so unreliable that that would really actually increase the amount of underground
You know,
damage.
Geoff, there's still jurisdictions that
They,
do that though in North America. They
yeah,
don't tend to locate it.
I'm
Yeah,
sure there are.
yeah.
But I know, for example, I'll give you an example from Netherlands and Flanders. They have an automated online system. All you do is you go online, you draw your little rectangle or whatever it is and say, this is where I'm going to dig. And within 24 hours, you'll have all the paper digital maps of whatever there is, they think is there. The problem is the data is unreliable. So you get this stuff quickly, but it's like fast access to bad data, right? I mean, that's really what's happening. And in North America, the system is actually, I think, is better because they send somebody out with an EM device, ground penetrating, whatever, to actually try to figure out where things are. They don't rely on the as-built, right? Because everybody knows the as-built are unreliable. The trouble is, it costs utilities and telecoms a lot of money to maintain these fleets of locate vehicles, right? Or they contract it out to somebody, but they have to pay those guys. And the locate industry in North America is huge. If you go to, you know, the big event in Phoenix every year, it's football fields of people selling things for detecting things underground or whatever. But anyhow, getting back to your original point, I think the really key to this, and this is another area where Colorado is really leading the charge, is that there has to be ways of capturing this information and sharing it. Right? So in Colorado, if you do any work in the state right of way, whether you're a contractor, a locator, a network owner, operator, anybody who does any work, you know, has to use a single online, well, I call it single mobile plus cloud solution, which allows you to share that information with everybody else. So this information is no longer just being captured and going into project files down in the basement. It is now being shared with everybody who works on CDOT projects.
Now,
And that to me is probably the most important advance, because instead of taking $10 billion and tearing up the bills on a cold winter day out in the field, we're capturing the, you know, I mean, we're capturing the information. So the next time somebody comes to that area, you know, and needs to know what's underground, they can say, well, we got a database. We know what we found last
hmm,
time.
interesting. Now, I know this. I'm putting on my former hat on again. What about security? If we're putting everything in one centralized place, are we not worried about security and the conveyance of that information getting into the wrong hands?
Okay, so there's I would break this into two levels of security. One is cybersecurity, standard cybersecurity. it's standard stuff. This is internet, and this is all. And there's everybody knows the government's put a lot of effort into that. But for this kind of data, I think the thing that is probably even more important, well, equally important, is data. What I would call data protection. And that means that there are rules about who can see data, how much data they can see, and how often they can see it. And I'll give you a very specific example applying to telecoms. Telecom is a very competitive business, right? So when telecoms are asked to share data on something like what's going on in Colorado or what's going on in the UK with the National Underground Asset Registry, they are very leery unless there is a strong data protection policy. And I'll just give you some examples of the kinds of things they worry about. If I'm a telecom in the UK, for example, I want to make sure that my competitors, and sometimes other people, my competitors, can't go in there and see where my network is, right? Because if I know that Vodafone is putting fiber into this area, right, then I've got some very useful information that can tell me, boy, maybe I should go into that area, or why are they doing it? There must be something out there that's motivating them to do that. So there are mechanisms in online systems, and newer will have this protection. Will say you can't look at more than 500 meters at a time of a network, right? You can't do 3,000 queries against somebody's network. It will restrict who can actually see that network. Things like that are they're all part of a data protection package.
Interesting.
And
But how do you
sometimes
do that, Geoff? How do you do that when you're trying to design a highway that is 50 miles long? How do you do that?
usually the way it's done is you often name who can see the data. Right? In other words, you can say, my competitor, Vodafone, can't see this data, but the Highways England can see this data.
Yeah.
It will still be restricted. It'll
Or the
say, okay,
GC,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, it's still restricted. You can't see more than 50 This project is 50 kilometers long. You can't see more than 50 kilometers. You can't query it multiple times. There's still other things like that. But, you just name them. You say, these are the only people who can see this data, and Vodafone can't see it.
Geoff, I'm going to ask you, what
Yeah.
about all the unregistered and undocumented utilities out there? How are we going to take care of that
Oh, boy.
problem? If we're talking about
Oh,
conveyance
boy.
of
Well, okay.
information
The never-ending problem, yeah.
Okay, I know. But there's a big difference. When you call the one call center in North America, those guys contact specific utilities, specific telecoms. Those guys come out and look for their infrastructure, right? You call up the gas company, they're not going to look for the electric infrastructure for you. They're going to come out and find their gas infrastructure. The electric company will find its electric infrastructure. The water company will find its water, and the telecoms will try to find their infrastructure. Nobody's looking for abandoned or unowned stuff. But that's where the Sioux survey, that has been mandated in Colorado comes in. Sioux surveys are looking for everything underground, abandoned, unowned, gas company, water company, whatever. I mean, I'll give you an example of things that can happen. Is that a water company, for example, might have had a pipe, or might have had a wastewater pipe down, and they might have said, well, okay, we abandoned it. Sometimes they even take it out of their GIS. They say it's not ours anymore; it's abandoned. Well,
Wow.
what often happens is the gas company will come in to install a new pipe, or a telecom will come in to install new fiber, and they'll say, "Hey, this is cool. Let's just put it down this old pipe." And I mean, so on one level you say, "Oh, this is abandoned," but you really have to tap it. You have to tap that thing because you don't know what somebody else has put inside it. That's the kind of problems you run into with this old infrastructure, right? And that's not a one. I mean, that happens frequently. The number of times you find a gas main, or you find a fiber going down an old pipe is phenomenal.
I actually have
Do you have any
And
numbers
another,
around
I have a
that,
story
Geoff?
about that. In City of Toronto, they had their old fire suppression network downtown, and you go looking downtown now, and all of a sudden, all those old water chambers now say AT&T, Metronet, MFM, like they all.
yeah,
So yeah.
uh,
So what they did was they actually took their old fire suppression system in downtown Toronto, their
yeah,
old fire main system, and just took it,
yeah,
sold it to a fiber company, and there you go.
yeah. Yeah, sure.
Yeah,
Well, I mean, on one level, it makes sense. The problem is it's got to, somebody's got to record
yeah,
what is
yeah.
there. That's the problem. Yeah.
Yeah, I've even seen it done in gas mains, also downtown Toronto. I remember the old LP system was sold to a company called Metronet, and they literally ran fiber optics through the old cast iron gas mains. So now, a guy comes
Yeah.
across that gas main, it's an abandoned gas main, starts cutting into it and goes, "Oh, wait a minute, we just got a fiber." So just
Yeah. Another real big problem area is trenchless digging. Gas companies and telecoms often use trenchless digging, and that leads to a really big problem, which is called cross bores, which means they're putting a gas main down your street. It goes through your sewer lines. It might go through. I mean, anything underground. They don't. They can't really guide it that well, and they often don't know really where it went. So it's not uncommon to find a gas line going through a sewer, for example, up to a house. A lateral going up to a house. And what can happen, of course, is it can get blocked up because you've got this pipe going through a sewer pipe. Things block up. And then you call the router guy and say, hey, listen, I got a blockage here. He comes and grinds through, and it's a gas main. Right? Gas backs up into the house blows up. It's actually quite
yeah.
dangerous. And this cross-bore business is $1 billion business.
Well, I know that a lot of energy companies have realized that this is a problem, and they actually have their call before you clear program as well, where they'll go out and actually,
Oh, is that right? No, I didn't know that.
Enbridge,
Yeah.
Citizen Energy, all the ones who've had incidences in their network, and actually a lot of them have. Now, the funny thing is, in North America, is divided up into a few zones. You have the northern states, and in Canada as well, where you have a frost line. So you always assume that the water and sewer will be very deep. Now, because of circumstances and geography and actual terrain, you sometimes actually might have that sewer which will be very shallow, and then you know take a deep dive down. So, for example, elevated properties or a property without a basement, that sewer is actually going to start off very shallow and then dive down into that main network. In the meantime, in southern United States, because there is no frost line, you could have sewers 1 to 2 feet down and still have a gravity system.
Yep.
So it's really
Yep.
it's really understanding where you are and understanding what the network's
Yep.
doing, and really making sure that you're even covering yourself by, okay, did I call before I cleared, or am I gonna actually damage any other items? Which also comes to another thing, which really I think about all the time. Back in the
Before you
yeah
jump off that, I think you've highlighted a real problem with the data that is beginning to be addressed by the new standards, and that is we rarely have depth or Z for any of this infrastructure. We've got some XY, but we rarely have depth or Z for any of this infrastructure. And the new standards that we were talking about, 3821, 75, S250, actually start realizing that this is 3D data, and that knowing how deep something is actually important
It's
information.
actually not. I'm going to add on that not only 3D, but it's geodetically correct. Because
Yes.
you could tie something off to a physical fixed object, but is that fixed object going to be there in 10 years from now? You actually have to take
That's
it and
right.
tie it into your DT and your digital terrain modeling. It's a really, really important thing.
And in some parts of Canada, of course, with subsidence and whatever, things move. Right? So depth is actually not always a constant.
I was talking to an engineer in California, and he said, "Well, because of our seismic issues, we have utilities that move as well." So that's that's a whole other issue on itself.
Oh yeah, seismic areas, it can be even worse. Yeah, it could be even worse.
Now that we were talking about it, I regress because now I can't recall what I was leading into. The information you give is always so vast and so interesting. I wanted to ask you about all the different organizations you're involved in, to try and actually promote this awareness of utility infrastructure. I see your blog, Between the Poles, and I really love it. But what else are you doing? Because I know that you've approached me on a few conferences and so on and so forth. So what else are you doing to promote this?
Right. Okay. So let me talk about Canada first. At the beginning of this year, we organized what we called the Canadian Underground Forum. which was a you participated over here. You helped organize it, as you know. You made a major contribution to that event and getting
Our
speakers.
very own Ophir.
Yeah, very. He was. Ophir, you were just tremendous, and the speakers you were able to find. So that was their first attempt in Canada to try to do, and it was really an international event, right? I mean, Ophir, we had people from all the United States, from Europe,
from Israel.
I don't know why we called it. I don't know why we called it Canadian, because it was really an international event. And I think and it was, the interesting thing about it is that it was not focused on underground practitioners, right? It was not something that said, oh, if you buy this EM device, you can find things better, or you can ground penetrate anywhere. It was focused more on a strategy of how we're going to deal with this problem. So we had people from ASCE, we had people from 4M, startups like 4M. We had people from government organizations like, Cabinet Office in the UK, talking about how we're going to address, all the things we've been talking about. So now we have a follow-on for that. We were organizing a follow-on for that conference. It's not going to be called Canadian Underground Forum this time. It's going to be called Subsurface Utility Mapping Strategy Forum. So to make it clear, this is not for practitioners. This is not for somebody who wants to know how they can use their EM device better or something like that. It's for people who want to address the big problem. Right? It's going to be March 22nd, 23rd. We have a LinkedIn group. I think you just look up SUMSF on LinkedIn and you'll find it. We have a lot of people signed up for that right now. And like I said, it's going to be March 22nd, 23rd, and it will be totally virtual. It's free for participants. So that's one thing. The other thing that's going on is an initiative by the Open Geospatial Consortium, OGC, and it's called MUDDI, M-U-D-D-I, and I forgot what it's an acronym for, but something to do with underground. The U, I think the U stands for underground. But it is an initiative that the OGC has had underway for quite a while to come up with some standards for sharing information about the underground. And the newer project in the UK, the National Underground Asset Register in the UK, is using this standard. And other jurisdictions like New York, there's a project in New York called UNUM that is using this standard. So there are people actually using this standard already. So I think it's not going to be one of these, academic exercises. It's going to be a standard that a lot of people will be using for sharing underground stuff. So those are two of the things, and there's other things, but and like I said, I participated in advising what's going on in Minnesota. I've participated with what's going on in the UK. Singapore really has a comprehensive program for dealing with the underground. Not just underground utilities, but underground geotechnical information, tunnels, transportation networks, all sorts of stuff. Because in Singapore, they really need the underground. They have so little land that they have to use every little bit they have, and they've had a comprehensive program that they have done with the university in Switzerland to put together a comprehensive program to deal with the underground, and they are just beginning on an implementation of what they've come up with.
Interesting.
And yeah, that's a few things. Yeah.
Is it because of their legislative process that they can do that, or is there a difference between the governments?
Yeah. No, planning in Singapore is paramount. They don't just create planning documents and throw them on the shelf. They plan things and then they do them.
Interesting.
It's a very centralized place, so it's a little bit easier to do than maybe in other places. But everybody watches Singapore. I mean, everybody watches Singapore. The Singapore water system is something that people have been watching for years. So they've given talks about what they're doing with Singapore because there's a shortage of water and they have to be careful with it and all this kind of stuff. So Singapore is a model. I think the UK is a model, and I think Colorado is a model. But they're models for different jurisdictions. They're not doing the same thing. They're all doing something differently. What works in the UK does not work in the US. If you tried to take that newer project in the US in the UK and apply it, have the federal government set up a repository for all this information in the US, I don't believe it would work. But what Colorado is doing I think works in North America, and that will be a model for a lot of states and provincial jurisdictions. And if you look at Singapore, it will be a model for certain types of countries. They can to do that. I mean, the grandfather of all this is Japan.
Interesting.
Let me give you a statistic. This is my favorite statistic. Every year in the United States, there's somewhere between 500,000 and 800,000 incidents of hitting underground infrastructure. It's like one every minute or two, right? Somebody hits something underground. So 500,000 to 800,000 incidents, and those are just the recorded ones.
Incredible.
In Japan, you know what the number is? In 2016, the last time I had, 135. I'm not leaving off zeros. 135.
That makes it feel really bad.
Yeah. It shows you that you can do something about it. Right?
Interesting.
That's the message to me. It shows you that you can do something about it. Japan, Tokyo, if Moses went and stuck his staff in the ground in Tokyo, he wouldn't just hit water or whatever. He would hit telecom, he'd hit water, he'd hit gas, he'd hit fuel lines, he'd hit everything under the sun. It would be a mess. And they had this problem, I think in 83, 84, 85, they were having problems hitting things underground. So they set up what was called RODIC, which is the Road Information Center in Tokyo. It was first all in Tokyo. But they basically used a big mainframe system. It required a lot of government money, but they basically put together a 2D system for recording what was under the streets in Tokyo. And starting there, they have, involved all the stakeholders, contractors, utility companies, road, highway, government road agencies, everybody's involved. So there is a culture of accurate as-built. When you submit an as-built, it's not, a design document. It's really an as-built document. When you expose something, you report it. The construction guys have rules that whenever you get within 50 centimeters of something, you have to use hand tools. You can't use power. There's all sorts of things, and it's a culture. The whole culture works on this principle that we don't want to hit things.
Interesting. In terms of your vision, in terms of what you've seen, what is that shining light which is really giving you a smile every day, saying, okay, we can go on, we're really getting better? Or is there one?
Well, first of all, there is. First of all, awareness. The fact that a national government in the UK has deemed this important enough to spend millions of dollars on this project over a 4-year project. It's an awareness thing, I'd say Colorado is another example. I mean, that to me, Colorado, UK, Singapore are shining examples of a level of awareness, that highest levels of government, right? I mean, this thing in the UK, this is a highest level of government. This is the cabinet office in London that is doing this project.
Wow.
Right? You look at Colorado, this was legislation. This was in the state legislature. This was not just a regulator in the state legislature. This was not just a regulator, saying, oh, I'm going to change the rules or something like this. This required legislation in the Colorado legislature. Right? And to get the attention of legislators to spend time on passing these bills, that's incredible. I'd even point at, Ontario. This, building transit better. The fact that they really focused on how are they going to coordinate utilities on these projects, because the awareness that utilities could really screw these projects up, hold them up for years, cost more. I mean, those to me are shining examples of awareness. Right? There is such a level of awareness in the highest levels of government and the highest levels of, C-suite and contractors or whatever about this problem. And that, to me, means that something will happen.
Now, I'm going to ask you another question, just in terms of, we do have these best practices, and in absence of a law, a best practice would be that precedence for that lawsuit. Would that not actually create a mechanism where people don't want to end up in court and saying, wait, we have these best practices, why aren't we using them? For example, like the TAC guidelines and all those other CSAS 250. Would that not be a kick?
Yeah, well, the TAC guidelines are fantastic. Yeah. I mean, it basically, to me, it says the foundation for the future is SU surveys.
Yeah.
During planning, I think they might say up to 30% design or something like that. But the fact that we go out and design these projects without knowing where anything is underground, we have centimeter accuracy above ground, we have no clue underground. I just find it incredible that we still do that. You know? And then we go relocate these things, and it costs millions to relocate a major transmission line that you didn't know about. You know, I mean, it's incredible. But I mean, I think there is really good evidence now that people are aware of the problem. They are aware of the cost of the problem. They are aware of the impact on the public, on the workers. You know, I mean, I think the awareness now, and it's the highest levels of government and organizations and transportation agencies and contractors. You know, this is not the little guy down in the locate group, down in the utility that is aware of. And this is highest level. You can walk into a utility and say, I've got a solution for your underground problem. Or you walk into a contractor, you can go to the C-suite and say, I got a solution for your underground problem. They will jump on it.
Interesting.
10 years ago, like you said, Ophir, 10 years ago, what underground problem? What do you mean underground problem?
No, that's
Geoff, what's your biggest piece of advice for the designers at the very initial stages? What would you say to them?
Get a SU survey before you even start designing anything.
interesting. And you know, we're looking at all these technologies again, SU surveys and all those different things. They are professional practice. They're professional practice items. Is there anything else that you're taking a look at, like really technology driven, which we could do right now, so we can go forward with you know, the beginning of our master planning and understanding what's.
Well, I think we need more companies like 4M. I mean, you know, when I first heard about 4M and heard that 4M was using satellite imagery to map underground infrastructure, I said, "Oh, wow, where's that coming from?" Everybody else was doing ground-based. You know, they had a new EM device, they had a ground-penetrating radar device, they were using, you know, audio. I mean, there was a lot of technologies, but it was all ground-based. You had to walk along someplace. You know, the biggest thing that was happening was that you could put a ground-penetrating radar array on the back of a van or in a trailer and drag it down, capture things really quickly. But then you still had to analyze it. You know, you still needed a geotechnical expert to try to figure out what was down there.
And
And
boots
when
on
I
the ground.
first, yeah, and boots on the ground, and that's dangerous work. You know, it is really dangerous work trying to do that stuff with a push cart in the middle of heavy traffic. And when I saw this, what 4M was doing, I thought, this is remarkable. No boots on the ground. You can do it anywhere in the world, right? It can be done much more quickly than some guy walking down a street. And I think we just need a lot more 4Ms. I mean, I think we need more
Geoff, you were
technology.
stealing our sales pitch.
No, I'm sorry.
No, the truth is that this was completely unsolicited, by the way. I did not set Geoff up for this, but really, Geoff,
No, you didn't. I didn't know you were going to ask me that
but
question.
I appreciate that. But can
No, I'm
we
serious.
leverage technology to really get up to that SU investigation?
We are. I mean, it seems to me like every 3 months I see something new. You know, I've seen a company in France, for example, that has put a magnetometer on a drone. Think of that, right? I mean, this is not quite as, you know, as cool as what 4M did, but still, the fact that you could send a drone down a street rather than boots on the pavement, send a drone down, or across a field or whatever, captures things much quicker. You know, and I think it was like centimeter accuracy with this thing. I mean, it's being investigated by the French research agency and so on. But that's just an example. I mean, there's going to be, you know, like I said, you look at the VC capital going into this stuff right now. There's going to be a lot more. I hope there's going to be a lot more 4Ms. You know, Skipper, which is the name of this company in France that is using drones. I think we're going to see a really rapid advance in detection. You know, detection, reality capture for new stuff, which is really advanced. I mean, the fact that we can have RTK in the field, you know, hooked up to a cell phone. I mean, that is really huge, as you highlighted, Ophir. And the other thing is the other part of it, which is the sharing data, that is going to require legislation, regulation, and technology.
That's absolutely amazing. Just so you know, putting an EM or a magnetometer on a drone is not a new thing, and that has been.
No.
It
isn't a new thing, but this is the first time I've seen really hard results showing the precision that you can get with it.
Interesting.
Like I said, it was the French. It's the French National Research Agency that is doing the tests on this thing, and it's the reason you haven't seen Skipper all over the marketing all over the place, is because they're still validating what they're doing.
I know that the military has been using that for years as well. So that's really interesting. How again technology has been built in the military.
Yeah, the military,
and then it evolves into that civilian application. Really interesting.
Yeah. Sometimes you see stuff that doesn't make a lot of sense. I've seen things, for example, let's put ground penetrating radar on a drone. I mean, no. There's some things you can do with it, but it's not going to be used for underground infrastructure.
That's interesting. Wow.
Geoff, before we wrap up, I have one last question. Who do you think should be our next guest on our podcast?
Well, I would recommend that if you want to follow on this theme, that I would get somebody from Colorado.
Yeah.
Rob Martindale would be really a good. I would get somebody like Neil Bramall from UK to talk about, see, one of the things that you have to do, we haven't talked about this at all, but one of the things you have to do when you put together a shared database is you got to come up with a common data model. Everybody has to agree that this is the common data model. You have to come up with a common symbology. What does a blue line represent? Right? You have to come up with a common terminology. In other words, when I say span, what does that mean? And Neil Bramall he did that for the whole Newer project. That's what he did. And the other thing I would say would be Rob Van Son from Singapore.
Interesting. It's funny to say
Geoff,
that.
we're counting on some introductions.
It's
sure, absolutely. Yeah, I'm sure all those guys would love to participate in this. It's podcast.
Really funny you say that. My former colleague Lawrence Arcan, who was one of the co-chairs of the CSAS 250 committee way back when, he said it took them 10 meetings to all agree that water was going to be blue. And they were meeting there.
No,
they were meeting twice a month.
I've had the same thing. I used to participate in these symbology meetings. It's amazing how much time you can spend because, this engineer wants to have this. The guy who goes out in the field wants to see that. And if he doesn't see it, and, utilities were very strict on their standards, right? For, how they depicted underground stuff. And when you bring two different utilities together, you got a problem. You bring 10 utilities together, you got an even bigger problem. And I'll tell you a problem that we have in North America that the UK doesn't have. The UK has a standard map. What I call a standard base map, master map. It's called master map. Everybody uses it. Okay. In North America, every utility has a different base map.
Interesting.
So the location of street center lines are different on different utilities maps, right? You think of, you say, okay, great, we're going to take all this utility information, we're going to put it on one map. Well, which map?
Yeah, the pedigree. Who's right?
Yep.
What do we do? Is it MTM or is it UTM? Is it local? Is it?
Yeah. But it's really a base map problem. It's not a projection problem. It's a fact that that you can buy base maps from different companies in North America, right? I mean, you can buy them from here, you can buy them from everybody, and the location of a center line is different on each one of those maps.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
All right, David. Anything else? I've had a great hour here.
I think this was an amazing episode. We learned so much. We read a lot of your blogs, Geoff. Like every time you put one out, we take an immediate deep dive. But I think kind of getting you on for 60 minutes and hearing everything you have to say, I think has been very, very, very interesting and practical at the same time for our listeners. So it was really, really great to have you on.
You know what? Sorry, I just want to ask one.
David, thank you for that.
1 second. Geoff, you actually live in Ottawa, Canada, do you not?
Yep.
And you travel the world and you always see utilities.
I used to. I haven't been anywhere since January 6, 2020.
Right. That being said, do you have that problem that anywhere you go in the world, when you used to travel, you look at utilities, you look up, oh wait, there's a pole, oh wait, there's a survey marker. Like, do you have that issue? Because personally,
well, like I said, over the years, for 25 years, I've been worrying about underground stuff, and everywhere I went, whether it was Malaysia or Japan or India or whatever, I'd try to find somebody who knew something about underground. I usually could find somebody, some small group that was doing something. You know, and I put together a white paper with a Japanese colleague of mine maybe a year or two ago, where I tried to put a compendium, and I had 25 or 30, you know, things from around the world of what people were doing. They were all different, and I think a number of them don't exist any longer. But obviously, people had recognized this problem and were trying to do something about it, but it hadn't percolated to upper levels of government or upper levels of contractors. It was a very specialized little group that knew something about it. You know, I mean, it's quite
I
remarkable.
was actually talking about
you know,
you,
what's
Geoff.
happened
Do
since then.
you have that recognition? Like when you're walking in England, for example, do you look down and look at the valves and try and start figuring?
I avoid construction sites anywhere in the world. I don't want to be blown up like Merrimack or Colorado or whatever. I mean, you know, and it's like that. I mean, I would, you know, consciously avoid a construction site if I know that they're just going to start digging.
I'm actually drawn to them. I always want to look and peek and see how the utilities, you know, what do they look like? You know, what their configurations. It's really amazing.
Well, I hope they solve this problem before you get blown up.
Fear laughs in the face of danger. So.
I've been through that before. I don't need that again. But yeah, that's for another conversation.
Right. Yeah, I'm sure.
All right. Perfect.
Anyway,
Anyhow, you know, David, I want to thank you very much for having me on this. I mean,
no, it's been a pleasure.
Anything we can do to get the word out on this, I think is really important.
Fantastic.
Oh, we'll have you on for a second episode.
Great. I look forward to it.
All right.
Okay.
Well,
Geoff, thank you so much.
Thank you. Enjoy.